right. Hello, everyone. Hope everybody got some food, something to write with. You don't have anything on it. Good. Yeah, okay. Look at okay. Yes, thank you for joining us today for this death penalty action panel. I'm really, really excited to hear from these speakers. I hope you guys are too. As we listen to their stories, I really want people to just notice what you're feeling in your bodies as you listen, and take note, like, of anything that comes up while you're listening. Responses to what the speakers are saying, or responses to questions that you might have, or questions you. Okay, so I'll just start by introducing the speakers. That sounds good. First, we have the Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, who is a Catholic priest, the founding dean, and the Reverend Charles Moore Professor of Prophetic Theology at the New Theology School, and the convener of Clergy United Against the Death Penalty. Dr. Hood is the author of over 70 books. It's incredible, and he served in the governing leadership of multiple organizations, including the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty and Fellowship of Reconciliation. Currently, Dr. Hood serves on the board of advisors of Death Penalty Action. And then we also have Sarah Gregory. Sarah Gregory's grandmother, Dorothy Dottie X, was murdered by a friend of her family, James Jimmy Barber. And afterward, Sarah struggled with substance use and trying to forget her pain and her anger for over 13 years. And after getting clean, Sarah wrote a letter to Jimmy and found healing through that process of forgiveness and through striking her friendship. And that friendship persevered to Jimmy's execution in July 2023. I have a quote from Sarah here that I thought was really powerful. I've now experienced 2 murders in my life. Both changed me, both shattered me, and I pray that together both will lead me to be the person I was always meant to be. And finally, we have Randy Gardner. Randy Gardner is the brother of Ronnie Lee Gardner, the last man executed by firing squad in Utah in 2010. Randy is now an anti-death penalty activist. His advocacy includes working with Journey of Hope, which is a nonprofit that unites families of the condemned with families of murder victims on speaking tours against the death penalty. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. The way that I thought this could work is we could just go in order of appearance. People could share their stories. This is just sort of an opportunity to share like a human element of the law, which I think is often lacking in law school. So if we could start with the Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, you could share your experience where you started with this work and anything that you like for us to know about your story in this work.
All right, thank you. Can y'all hear me? Perfect. So quick question. How long are we supposed to speak for this part?
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I can really get to talking sometimes. So, all right. So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I am a quintessential child of the Southern United States. And somebody who grew up in a culture dominated by violence and tales of bloodshed. Ultimately, I think that, the Southern ethos, violence underlines everything that we do, including the death penalty. And, I think it's important to talk about violence as a wider phenomenon than just the death penalty. Violence is something that undergirds, again, not just Southerners, but everything we do. We live in a culture and in a society that's sending billions and billions of dollars overseas to bomb and annihilate different people, most of whom we have no contact with and no knowledge of. I think that connects directly to most people's experience with the death penalty, in that the death sentences are carried out, the death penalty happens in our country with people having very little understanding or recognition of what is actually happening. so I think it's important to understand that we live in a society that is so accustomed to violence that we really don't pay attention too much at all, from the street level to the execution chamber level. And so, as I sort of pushed into my faith and experienced deeper understanding of what I considered the message of Jesus to be, I became more and more acquainted with the fact that what I was being taught at church growing up didn't have anything to do with the message that Jesus actually taught. For instance, I remember one of my Sunday school teachers growing up say something. There was a case, I can't remember which case it was, but there was a death penalty case that was getting a lot of attention in the 90s in Georgia. And I remember one of my Sunday school teachers saying something to the degree of, well, if Jesus was here, we could all execute him ourselves. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is so often our understandings of vengeance and hate and violence seep into our religious understanding and our spiritual understanding too, until we consider them to be one and the same. I saw a shirt here in Little Rock, Arkansas yesterday with someone who had Donald Trump hanging on a cross, dying for all of our sins. Again, you get weird things start happening when you start mixing violence and spirituality and government. But nevertheless, probably the foremost moment of my trajectory towards being involved in this work is I was doing one of my master's degrees at Emory University there in Atlanta, and we were certainly the epicenter. I mean, Atlanta is certainly the epicenter of the civil rights movement in many ways, and I think that role continues. But in this moment, it was the epicenter of the campaign to try to save Troy Davis. And in that moment and in that work, I became very well acquainted with Troy Davis's case, and it was a very Southern case. Troy Davis was convicted of killing a white police officer in Savannah named Mark McPhail. There was a lot of questions as to whether he did it, the role that race played. And I remember, y'all might be a little young, although it looks like we got some older people in the class from what I can see in this little screen. But I am an Obama child. I was one of these kids in 2008 who thought that everything would be solved if we would just vote for hope and change, if we would just trust government as to what government could do and how government could save us. And I remember everybody in Atlanta talking about how Barack Obama was going to save Troy Davis. And I remember, of course, at this time, I had very little understanding of litigation and how all these types of things work, but I really believed that. And of course, Troy Davis was ultimately executed, and I was standing outside of the prison. And I remember thinking that, Barack Obama didn't stop the execution. The governor of Georgia didn't stop the execution. Nobody stopped the execution. If these executions are to stop, then it's up to me. And it's up to us. And it made me really realize that there was such a stark separation between what institutions can do and what the individual can do. And I think that so often we're told that we have to trust institutions. We have to trust processes. And I think that my work has largely been about placing myself into conversation and in relationship with these guys on death row with the belief that an individual loving another individual can change the world. And I think that ultimately, I think that's the only way the world has ever changed, is one relationship at a time. And so my work on various death rows throughout the country is about ministering to these guys who are in, just the lowest of lows. The scriptures talk about that God is present in the least of these. Well, these guys are the least of the least. There's a sense in which they're forgotten about, they're hated, they're ignored. And I think that something that I've learned in this ministry is that they are a reflection of us. And so often we think to ourselves, oh, these guys they have nothing to do with us. Oh, this is something other. This is something, that's a murderer. That's a monster. That's a killer. But what we don't understand is that these folks are closer to us, closer to, who we are, who we claim to be, than perhaps anyone else in our society. And I know that folks say, well, wait a second, that's too much. Well, I don't think it's enough. I mean, my goal is to put people on death row. And what I mean by that is I want the people that I meet in situations like this in public to actually be put on death row. I want them to know what it looks like to be subjugated to the cruelty and inhumanity that we maintain on death rows throughout the country. I also think that in terms of reforming our criminal justice system, I want people to understand what it means to put someone in solitary confinement for decades on end. I want people to understand what it does to the soul and to the psyche to put someone in prison and never give them the chance of getting out. And so I guess the way that I've sought to do that is by telling stories. And so I'm going to tell a couple, and y'all go ahead and cut me off when it's time, because I've lost track of time at the present moment. But I got this one story a number of years ago. A guy by the name of Christopher Wilkins. He was executed in Texas. And Christopher Wilkins was one of the first guys that I ever came in contact with on death row. They called him Cujo. I think it was Cujo. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But Cujo. And ultimately, Cujo was, hold on. Sorry, this is one of my guys in Missouri. But anyways, so Cujo, he got me to visit him, and I did. And right before I went in, I called my wife, and she said, I got this crazy letter. I said, what are you talking about? This cat, Christopher Wilkins, had sent this like really vulgar letter to my wife right before, with the idea that he was trying to time it when I would be in there visiting him so that she would be reading it by herself. And I can tell you that I interact with people who had done such things. I've got another gentleman that I visited with. He was a serial killer of children. And we sat there and we talked. He's a very strange dude. He's still living. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him towards the very end of the conversation. And he said, yeah, can you send me a picture of your kids? And my point is, these are not all happy stories. These are not all gushy and lovely and loving stories. These are real stories. And so when we advocate for reform, when we advocate for the abolition of the death penalty, we are talking about, sometimes crimes that will make your stomach turn. I mean, stuff that, is again, the stuff that horror, nightmares are made out of. But at the same time, I've never been in, executed 5 different guys to the execution chamber. And sorry, Allie's texting me. So does this mean I'm saying too much? Let's see. 3 minutes, she says. So let me jump then to Kenny Smith and nitrogen hypoxia execution, and I'll close it out here. when we are willing to put ourselves in difficult hours and difficult positions, difficult situations, we can expect to be shocked and we can expect to be very, very uncomfortable. And with Kenny Smith, the nation's first nitrogen hypoxia execution last month, I could go on for a very long time, but I think it's important for people to understand that this was a situation in which we were told by government that this would be 2 to 3 seconds, and then the person would go unconscious. It would be very peaceful and all of these things. And I can tell you that I watched Kenny Smith right there in the chamber, feet away from him, for upwards of 8, 9, 10 minutes, slamming his head back and forth, back and forth. He had on a mask that was that covered his face with sort of a plastic or a glass in front of it. It was tied down to the gurney, so every time he pulled himself up, the front of his face hit the front of the mask, and so there was spit and saliva and mucus coming out of his mouth. It was catching on the mask and looked like a waterfall going down the front of the mask. My point in saying all of these visceral details is that when we allow ourselves to not see the death penalty, when we allow ourselves to not see violence, these are the things that begin to take place. And we slowly lose our humanity in the process. And so I'm glad that we've got some human beings, some good human beings, with Randy and Sarah, two of whom I've heard their stories before, but there is a human side to this. And it's not just, institutions, courtrooms, it's a society that is quickly devolving into an unbelievable manifestation of violence. And we saw that last month. And I think we will continue to see it get worse, if not for you wonderful law students who is going to solve all of this. Thank you.
Something you said really reminded me of the conclusion of Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, where he says that the most meaningful recipients of our mercy are the people who have never asked for it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So now we'll move on to Sarah. Sarah, if you want to share your story, anything that you would like for us to know. Love that.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? We're good. All right. Well, thank you for having me here. I see people chiming in from all over the world, honestly, which is pretty amazing. So I'm just here in little old Maryland. The end of my workday, so I get to go home after this. It's a nice way to end it. So I'm going to start by showing you a picture. So I'm going to cover my face for just a minute. I apologize. But this is my grandmother and my grandfather. That is Dottie Epps and George Epps. And I always like to show her picture first because, to me, she is the most important part of the story. She is the one that went through the most pain in order to get me to the point where I am today in my life. And I always like to start just telling you a little bit about her. She was, 73, 74. It's been over 20 years now, but she was about 73, 74 years old. She weighed barely 95 pounds. She was your perfect Southern belle, born and raised in the South. They lived in Harvest, Alabama, where I was born and raised until I was 18 years old when I came up north. So when you think of Scarlett O'Hare, you can think of her. We had a beautiful farm. My grandfather worked very, very hard to support his family, and he did very well. I had an absolutely amazing childhood, and my grandparents believed that every part of our family needed to be together. So my other set of grandparents and them, we did everything together all the time. My grandmother started a family reunion every 4th of July that continues to this day, where we have literally hundreds of people come. And she needed to know that she was going to have something that every year her family would be able to stop and come together and to remember what truly makes us who we are. And that's our family. And that's the things that we go through together and the trauma that we survive. So in 2001, my brother was going to be getting married in July at the farm during that family reunion. And so she was having her house remodeled. And my aunt had a boyfriend of the past 7 years. And during that time, he had been off and on drugs. And in May of 2001, he had relapsed again, and my aunt had kicked him out. He was working at my grandmother's house, and my grandfather went out of, he went out of the country to Saudi Arabia. And right before he left, he came to the house and he asked for an advancement of money again, to which my grandfather told him no, he would do the work. My grandmother would pay him as the work progressed while my grandfather was out of town. And so he came back when he knew my grandfather was gone. And according to Jimmy, my grandmother politely offered him some coffee and some food, as of course she would. And when he asked her for money, she politely said no, and that he could welcome to come back the next day and that she would pay him before he leaves. And in Jimmy's words, he punched my grandmother, and she was hanging pictures on the wall that he had completed going up the stairs, and she had hung pictures that day. And so he said that he turned his head and saw the hammer sitting on the counter, and he grabbed it and he proceeded to beat her over 40 plus times. During that time, she fought for her life. There were defensive wounds up and down her arm. Her pacemaker was removed. Her eye was removed. And at one point in time, he had flipped her over and he stood on her back while he continued to beat her. So these are the things that kind of got him the death penalty too. He stole a purse, and the crime was heinous, to say the least. I think we can all agree that that definitely qualifies for a heinous crime. And when we went to trial, which by the way, his brother turned him in because his brother knew he had done it and he knew it was wrong. So his family was shattered just as much as mine was. They loved my grandmother just as much as we did. He had been around for 7 years. We all knew each other very, very well. So when they were talking to us as a family about the options to present to the judge and the jury, and if we wanted to go for the death penalty or not, we were less than 2 years away from all of that. We were still very, very raw, and we were still filled with rage. So when they asked us if we wanted the death penalty, we all said yes. We did. We couldn't stand to look at him. I could not say his name until about 4 years ago. I absolutely could not stand him. Not only did he, when he killed my grandmother, he literally took my aunt to a movie the next day. Like absolutely nothing was wrong. And then went back to my grandmother's house that night to rob her again and walked over her body again. And so you have all these thoughts and feelings running through your head, and you're asked, what kind of punishment do you want for this man? And you go for everything you got. And that, like I said, that was our stance. So he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death in Alabama. He was shipped to Donaldson prison for most of his term before he was moved down south, further south to Holman prison. And as was said, I totally lost myself. My substance use had started beforehand anyways, realistically, but it went off the chain. It absolutely went off the chain after this. And I did not stop using substances till I was 32 years old. In 2013, I finally got my life together and I woke up a little bit from when I was 21. So as a part of being in recovery, you work on yourself, right? You take a look at yourself and inside yourself and what makes us do what we do on an individual basis. And I had worked through many things in my life except for the murder in Jimmy. I had so much hate and just raw rage inside my heart for him. Still, many years later, I still had that rage and hate. But I was getting to the point, I was getting mad at myself for it. Like I could not stand the fact that I could not let it go. I still could not say his name. I was checking the internet all the time, making sure he was still incarcerated, like he was going to waltz out the door. I just had to make sure. And every time I would see his face on the internet, my heart would stop because everything would come flooding back. And I was getting so mad at myself. And so I had been doing a lot of praying and a lot of work trying to get to the point to where I could forgive him. I had a song moment, right? One of those times you're sitting in the car and you hear something and it's like, oh my God, did they write this for me? And exactly what I'm going through right now. And the song was talking about writing a letter and forgiving the person that caused you the most harm in your life and putting everything down on that paper and shooting it out. And it literally was that moment that I needed. And I totally broke down in my car. And then I went that night and I did exactly like that song said. I wrote it all out. I cried and cried, and I actually had to type it. So writing, I was typing because I knew if I actually wrote it out, I would probably give up. So I had to type really fast and I had to get my feelings out. And before I could think twice on it, I made myself mail it. Come to find out, I realized he moved from Donaldson and I got really mad because I had to do it again. But I did because I wanted to make sure that he had it. So I shipped it down to Holman too, and I just let it go. I started to feel better. I was able to say his name, James Barber. I was able to say his name, and I was able to not have as much anger towards him at that time. About a month later, I got a letter back from him, and I let that letter sit on my counter for a little over a week, just looking at the envelope before I could get myself to open it. When I finally got the courage to open that letter, that is when that weight left. Like, he owned everything. He was not vicious. He wasn't this monster. He was telling me things that he had been doing over the almost 20 years that he had been incarcerated and what it was like for him and the regret and the remorse and the nights of crying that he had for my grandmother. And it left, y'all. Like, it literally, that anger left. And he asked me if we could keep communicating. And I thought about it for maybe 15 seconds, and something in my mind told me, you have to do this. And so our relationship grew from that letter to more letters, to phone calls, to those little email tablets, things that they do, and probably about 3 to 4 phone calls a week. I started confiding in him and everything that was going on in my life. I learned about everything he had been through. I got caught back up in his family. He became that person again, right? Like I said, he was not a monster. He was a person. And over the next almost 3 years, he became one of the absolute best friends I've ever had. When something would go on, I would wait for his phone call. He was helping me with my son who has mental health. He had more time than I did to do some research, and he would. He got the guys at Holman to start praying for my son. They were talking to me on the phone to check in and see how he was doing. It just became this very natural, fitting friendship. And so he asked me if I would come, time check. He asked me if I would come to his execution once we got the date. I knew I needed to, because I knew that I needed to be somebody. I'm always like this bridge in my family, that pushes everybody together, and I'm that Switzerland in there. And I knew that I needed to be that person again. And so when I started to tell my mom that I was going to go to his execution, but with a different stance than I had before, my mom wanted to know how I could change. She wanted to know what made him not that monster, put that human side to him. So she asked me if I could have him call her. And the very first time that my mom ever talked to him, she absolutely forgave everything. And she started talking to him 2 to 3 times a day and went down to his execution with me. And it was my uncle, who may not have some of the exact same opinions that I do, and my aunt, who was just totally devastated because it was her mother and her boyfriend. And there was always a huge piece of me a huge piece of him that she loved. and then my mom and I, and it was the four of us in the room. And before that, I got almost 7 hours total with Jimmy and his family in the visiting area before his execution. I will never forget walking through those doors and seeing him through the second security, but seeing him in that glass right there, standing in that room, and this monster that I had envisioned that I couldn't even look at his picture and breathe at the same time was 2 to 3 feet away from me, waiting for that door to open. And all I could do was hurry up and get through that door. And we hugged for literally over a minute. And the guards were crying, and his family and church members were crying. I was the first victim's family who had ever come to see the accused, especially in a visitation like that. I was the first one that had ever brought some sort of unity there, to the fact that guards couldn't even put words to it. There were guards that were requesting us to sing songs like Amazing Grace, and Jimmy was so happy. Here he is facing his death, and all he could think about was that I was in the room with him and how happy he was. And his family and I, we had dinner with my mother that same night, and we asked to be in the same room together to support each other, and the state wouldn't allow it. My mom asked to see Jimmy, and the state wouldn't allow it. So they forced us to stay separate, and they forced us to stay in lockdown separately, trying to text each other and calm each other down as we wait to see what goes on. It was after it was 1:30 in the morning before we went into that execution chamber, and we went in lockdown at 3 p.m. You go into lockdown, you go into sections in the prison yard, in the grounds, and you have no communication with anybody until it's done. So from 3 p.m. till after 1 a.m., we all sat in total lockdown. And I remember when they opened up that curtain, and there it was, my friend now, not somebody I hated, but my friend that was laying there, and he could not move. And he was smiling, and he was joking with the guards, the same guards that had to stand by him and watch him die. And they were laughing and joking and saying goodbye because they had developed such a relationship together. And I just never forget when the IV started moving. They don't give you any warning either, but when the IV started moving and you can tell something was hitting him, he just turned and he looked at me, and he stayed looking at me until he closed his eyes. And if there's anything that I was able to do to him, was hopefully give some sort of peace and forgiveness before he left us in that room that day. And I hope that I was able to give my family some sort of peace and forgiveness, and to show them that we can love my grandmother at the same time, right? We can love and honor her and hate what happened to her with all of our being, but we don't have to hate him, right? I can love him, and I do have so much love for Jimmy. I can love him and be there for him at the same time, and his family, because we were all shattered. And yes, I have seen 2 murders, and absolutely they both shattered me in very different ways, but so very powerful ways at the same time. They absolutely both shattered me. And I absolutely walked out of that prison and totally different person than when I walked in. Even my husband said it. I was different from the time I called him the next morning. And I promised Jimmy in that very last hug that I gave him before I totally lost it like a sobbing fool, but I promised him that I would continue to share our story. He got the process started while he was here, and he knows how much I hate talking in front of people, but I promised him that I was not going to let Alabama win. Right? They were not going to shut him up by killing him. And so it's literally everything that I try to do now. Everything that I tried to do. So I'll leave you with this: Enduring Journey of Hope in Georgia. Was it just last month now? One of the other speakers would always say, and I love this so much, I asked her if I could steal it. She said, "Who would Jesus execute?" And I'll wait for the answer. And she would end it like that, and nobody could answer her, of course. So just think about that. Who would Jesus execute? And who does execution benefit? because I can't say it benefits one time. My uncle, who was more pro than anybody else, walked out of there crying. And I asked him later on if it was worth it, and he said absolutely not. There was nothing that came from that. So that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing. That was such a beautiful story. Yeah, I was thinking about something that Reverend Hood said about how he wants to place everybody on death row, and I feel like that's what you're describing. This fact that your survival and your humanity is mutual, and that forgiveness is really a saving grace. Thank you so much. Wow. Okay, last but not least, we have Ronnie Gardner. Same question. Please share your story, anything you'd like for us to know.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I appreciate you having me out in the University of Oregon and Death Penalty Action and the Journey of Hope. My story starts out 35 years ago. My little brother was born. Well, he was born actually in 1961. He was executed by the state of Utah by firing squad on June 18th, 2010. So it's been almost 14 years. And it's been a very rough road for me. I was recently diagnosed about 4 years ago with post-traumatic stress because over the years I couldn't quit dreaming about me executing my brother or me executing my kids, me executing my mom or my kids executing me. And it's just, I'm a pretty strong-willed person, but I couldn't get rid of this. It went on for over 8 years. I finally got a therapist and seek therapy, and it took about 3 years for me to, I haven't had those dreams in a year or two at all. But Ronnie we grew up in a poor neighborhood, poor family. We didn't know it. Very dysfunctional family. We didn't know it because everybody in the poor community seemed to be dysfunctional. But that being said, that's no excuse for what my brother did. He actually did commit 2 murders. He was in his life. He was going to court on the second one and tried to escape and shot a lawyer and killed him. My brother was shot in the same time, but they caught him at the courthouse, and he got the death penalty for that case. They told me to try to humanize my brother. Well, he was human. We're all human, and something Sister Helen Prejean says, the worst thing that someone does is not who that person was. And people make split-second decisions, and that's kind of what my brother has done throughout his life. He was locked up at the age of 10. They sent him to a mental institution for missing school. He used to go to school, and he'd go in the front door and out the back door. And my mom, being very dysfunctional with her family, and didn't just let him stay home and stuff. So the state finally intervened, put him in a mental institution. And I remember him, he was in there, they said he'd be in there for 30-day evaluation. He was in there at 11 years old for a little over a year. And he used to come home on home visits and say, Randy, this is crazy. He goes, they give these guys some drug called Thorazine, and they're like zombies, and they're walking around and doing a Thorazine shuffle, he used to call it. And that's the environment he was put in at a very young age. And come to find out, he had attention deficit disorder. And I think that's why he didn't like school. He wasn't learning like the rest of the kids. I don't like this phase, but he used to tell me, Randy, am I retarded? And that's, no, Ronnie, you're not. We didn't know we didn't know what was going on with him. But so from the age of 11 on, he was put in the mental institution. He finally got out of that, and he was around rough people in that mental institution. And he started committing petty crimes and stuff. So he was locked up again got out of there and locked up in the state industrial school. And that's for youths that are causing trouble. It's detention center. Thing is, Ronnie was always trying to escape. And the reason he was trying to escape, because of the stuff he was doing was not that bad. He just wanted to be home with his family, and so he'd escape. He escaped from state industrial school like 10 times, set a record in this place. It's secure lockdown facilities, but he was always escaping, trying to be with his family. be back with me. You know, we were best friends. He was 2 years younger than I am, and I have the guilt sometimes of myself of not being a very good big brother, and that again is part of my therapy. You know, I thought, God, if I'd have been a bigger brother, you know, this wouldn't have happened with Ronnie. But you know, things fell into place where, you know, things happen for a reason. You know, and it did bring out a fight in me, but I never in the world thought I'd be doing this type of stuff. So in some ways, I'm blessed because I'm one of the few that can do it. I don't like it, but you know, until the death penalty's gone here in the United States and even the world, you know, I'm going to keep fighting against it. The collateral damage that it's put on me and myself and my family is just crazy. The dreams I've had, and he has a daughter that's 47 years old. She's still 14 years later. She's still messed up about it, and she's not been able to get therapy and won't accept it. Of course, she turned to drugs and alcohol, which I have too. You know, over the years, I've actually, right now, I'm almost 7 months clean and sober, and that's the first time in my lifetime I probably accomplished that. And that's something through therapy and my own free will, I've decided to do that, and it's made my life much better and much, you know, but I was hiding behind the curtain of being an alcoholic and drugs, and that was the easy way for me to forget it. My brother's death was classified as a judicial homicide on his death certificate. When they released a death certificate to me, and they gave me pictures of the autopsy, because it was a judicial homicide, he had to have an autopsy. Well, we know how he died. He died with 4 bullet wounds to the chest. But when they released the autopsy photos, and by the way, I was asked if I could show them in this presentation, and then I think they decided that they were a little too graphic. I mean, which I understand. I've been arrested for showing those pictures at the Utah State Capitol in the galley of the legislative session when they decided they were to table the end of the death penalty. And I got up there in the balcony and held these pictures up and showed pictures to people. You know, this is someone's brother, this is my brother, someone's son. You know, he is human. Someone's dad. And they arrested me, detained me, and then released me because I was actually expressing my First Amendment rights. And I told the cop when they arrested me, I said, "You don't know what to do with me, do you?" And he goes, "No, I don't." I said, "Well, yeah, probably ought to just release me because, you know, I was exercising my First Amendment rights." And that's what they ended up doing. So, Randy, just don't come back to the Capitol tonight. And I got my point across. You know, I fought my whole life not to be arrested, same as my brother. And now I make them arrest me. I've been arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court 3 times, holding up banners, and you know, that kind of stuff makes it all worth it. I like the exposure. I've been involved with the Journey of Hope for 8 years, death penalty action for the last 5, and I don't know how death penalty action, but I used to go on tour a lot, speak all over the United States. We've even been to Uganda and Rwanda, starting anti-death penalty groups in those countries. Look, let's see. And the firing squad, you know. We have the firing squad here in Utah. Idaho has the firing squad. South Carolina has the firing squad. I don't know what these people are thinking. It's so barbaric. The pictures of my brother's body, I mean, he had a pair of white underwear on, and when I got the pictures, I looked at the underwear and I said, why'd they put, you know, first thought I had, why'd they put red underwear on him? Well, that's what happened. He bled out from him shooting him, blew his heart out at his back and his lungs. And they say the firing squad is more humane. It's quicker. My brother, according to autopsy reports and studies we've done, has probably lived 45 seconds after he moved. After the state of Utah thought they were going to have to fire a second round. There's 5 shooters, 4 bullets, and they're only 20 feet away. But when I first seen his chest, it was like a bowling ball with an extra hole. I mean, it was just so terrifying, you know. And from that point on, I started having those dreams and nightmares. But, you know, the United States, we're in company with Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, China, South Korea. That's who most of the modern countries in the world don't even have the death penalty anymore. You know, it's profound that United States, being the most civilized country in the world, so we claim, are still executing our own citizen. And to me, that's premeditated murder in its worst sense. You know, it's no different than, I fear that these states that are executing our citizens, I'm more worried about them. They want to do it. And they're so, Ron DeSantis and Governor Abbott and, you know, all these governors, that they could stop this stuff. It was the last execution by firing squad, and it was 14 years ago in the United States. We actually have a case coming up now that they put it on hold, but the guys run out of appeal. So the state of Utah are talking about doing this again. And there's people that chose the firing squad that are grandfathered in, but now they made it a law that if they can't get lethal injection drugs, they're going to execute them by firing squad. It was just a crazy circus out at the prison the night of this execution. You know, people from all over the world were following it. And it's like, that's when I first got involved in even doing any kind of public speaking or talking about this. And for me, I'm compelled. I have to do it. If I don't do it, I slip backwards. So, you know, I feel very fortunate, you know, because I'm one of those persons that can do it. But on the other hand, you know, I wish it would end so we wouldn't have to. You know, I wouldn't have to fight this no longer. It's tiresome. I've been doing it for 14 years. I'm going to keep doing it. I get to pick a little bit and choose more of what I do now. You know, so it's not something I do 6 months a year, but I stay involved. I'll be involved here in Utah. This gentleman on death row, he's been on there 40 years. He's an old man. He's 73 years old. Can't harm anybody. He's got dementia, and that's why the governor here he can only stay in execution for 6 months, but the courts have put it on hold for 60 days to give this guy another two mental evaluations to see if he, you know, if he does have dementia. It's been proved physically. They've taken x-rays of his head and stuff, but, you know, I think they're still hoping that this guy knows that he's being executed for, which his lawyers claim he don't. So they can murder this guy. And it's just, his name's Ralph Menzies. And, you know, it don't matter if you're innocent or guilty. To me, you know, we have no right killing our own citizens. And especially when, you know, they're normally not the same person they were when they went on there. Most people spend 20, 25, 30 years on death row before they're executed. The one in Idaho that they just failed in a lethal injection execution, he's been in prison 50 years and on death row 30 years. He's 73-year-old guy that can't harm anybody. You know, they can lock him up and throw away the key if they want. For him, his life's not going to be too long anyway. But I don't know what Idaho's going to do, but it wouldn't surprise me. I've testified in front of their legislative session before. And it wouldn't surprise me if they try to execute this man by firing squad. They couldn't find a vein, so I don't think they're going to try that again. But, you know, we don't know what they're going to do. I think it's people like me and Sarah, Jeff Hood, and Avon, which just, I know so many people that has had family members murdered, like Sarah was telling us, and they've forgiven them. And I think if I've learned anything about being involved with this anti-death penalty is forgiveness. And the first 4 years, I never in the world thought I would be able to forgive the state of Utah or the executioners or the governor. There was one point I was even going to go, the governor said that it's a little bit gruesome, the firing squad. So my frame of mind, drinking and drugging, I was going to go kidnap the governor's brother and execute him. That's where my mind was going back then. And of course, thank God I didn't. You know, I'd be on death row. But the forgiveness factor is so powerful, you know. And I finally woke up one day and I realized, you know what? I can forgive the governor. I can go hug those men that volunteered to shoot my brother in the heart and say, you know what? I forgive you. And I believe it to be true. And from that day on, I think my life changed a lot. Different. I used to have Bill Pelkey. He's an old timer that passed away a few years ago, but he got me involved in this. He was the president of the Journey of Hope and one of the original founders. But he kept saying, forgive Randy, forgive these guys, and hanging around people that had their grandmother murdered and they forgive the person, or Sarah's story, forgiving, Mr. Barber, Suzanne Bosler, good friend of mine, or Marietta Yeager. They're all people that forgive people that had murdered their loved ones. And it's such a powerful moment. But between now and then, we've got to fight. We've got to end this state sanctioned murders. It's not right. It's I hate to say it, but when Trump came into office, I had to throw that in. He started the federal executions, and they wrapped up 13 executions, and they hadn't had a federal execution in like 17 years. But with that, I appreciate you guys all letting me speak, and just keep on together. We can abolish the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you so much. That was so powerful. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear about an instance of the firing squad being used. What's interesting about the firing squad is that it, like you say, it's so brutal. It has this air of brutality because it lacks the usual pretense of sterility and medicalism that we have with stuff like lethal injection or now nitrogen gas. With the firing squad, you can only see it for what it is. So thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you, and congratulations on your sobriety. That's amazing.
Thank you.
And now we're going to turn to a Q&A portion. So I don't have any questions in the chat, so I'll just open it up. Ask our fine speakers today. If I can get us started, I have a question that to be a little selfish. I just am really curious what you guys think of this. Do you think that life without parole is an adequate replacement for the death penalty? I know most of the time when somebody doesn't get sentenced to death, they're sentenced to life without parole instead. Do you guys think that's good enough, or should we be shooting for some other solution?
I can answer that. I find life without parole to be absolutely horrific. I think that I struggle with even talking about it with regards to the death penalty, because I think it's really problematic when you create this kind of quid pro quo. And I think that oftentimes abolitionists do that. I mean, I know that most guys that I work with, their response is, I would rather be executed than be put in prison for the rest of my life. And so I know Kenny Smith, when he was executed last month, month before last, he very much said that he saw that as his release date. And I think that when you have people who are desiring to be executed, or who are happy to be executed so they don't have to spend the rest of their lives in prison, I think that should tell you everything you need to know about life without parole.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience before we switch to some questions from the virtual audience?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Most of us are not going to go get a career like just purely dedicated to death penalty action and ending the death penalty. Even with a few of us might, most of us are going to do a career in something else. What are ways that you think we can get and stay involved in what you guys do without, kind of wholeheartedly dedicating ourselves to it? Like you guys know, what are the small and medium ways that we can get involved?
I'll jump back in. I'm not going to answer all the questions, I promise. But I will say that, obviously advocacy, being involved, connecting. I mean, the reason that I knew Randy and Sarah's one better than the other or whatever before this is because we all have been involved. And I think that there's such a need for people to be involved physically, financially, in all sorts of ways. I also think that it's important for budding lawyers to realize that there are a wide variety of ways to gum up the system. I think there's a lot of people who think that, you know, that the only way that you can fight against the death penalty legally is to be a habeas attorney or perhaps a defense attorney or something along those lines. I mean, what we're seeing is that all sorts of attorneys are coming into play. I know that as far as lawyers with expertise in healthcare have been very active, especially with regard to nitrogen hypoxia. Lawyers with expertise in suing like medical malpractice suits, they've become major players. There are all sorts of ways of talking about this. And I will also add, and then I will stop, that in Alabama, you are not entitled to a state habeas attorney. Alabama is the only state that has a death penalty, from what I understand. Somebody in the chat, correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't have state level habeas attorneys, which means that what Brian Stevenson and Equal Justice Initiative have done is they're bringing in attorneys from all over the country to serve as state habeas attorneys. What that means is that Kenny Smith's two main lawyers were tax attorneys. There's another main attorney that was a litigant in, like, I think it was like shipping law or something you would never expect to represent someone on death row. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you want to help, there is always room to help. So my encouragement is to keep the desire.
So here's a couple questions from the chat. What should criminal defense lawyers be aware of when working with clients who are facing the death penalty?
I mean, one of my main ones is just remembering that they are humans also. They have family and they have loved ones. And then also, like I said too, when they asked us as a family if we wanted to seek the death penalty, and we were so filled with rage and everything was so new, we weren't making a rash decision. So I also don't really agree that the family should have a voice that closely after the murder of a loved one. I feel like you're just making decisions off of emotions and not thinking logically.
I have a question for you specifically, Sarah. Were you guys approached by any like victims' rights groups? And how did that impact your guys' opinion? I know when I've sat in on clemency hearings and different things, they really rile up the victims, and there's been clemency hearings where clemency was denied and the victim's family is just like screaming and shouting and hollering like they were so excited. And it just feels so wrong to be in a space like that where people are celebrating death. So I just was curious what your experience with that was, if you have any.
No, we were never contacted. We had our only contact was with the state's attorney family liaison throughout the years. And as soon as the state found out that I was communicating with Jimmy and that my mother we were totally cut off of communication with them. I'm actually really amazed they allowed me in to view the execution because they opposed me being there so much. But they totally cut us off as soon as we found out. So they didn't want to hear anything that it had to do with forgiveness or that we had changed our mind. We wanted to advocate that he not be executed. They had no communication with us. And one time they accused my mom of giving him information, and she literally had talked to him for like 2 months before the execution date, but they started to accuse her of giving him and his attorneys information that they were sharing with her.
And then one more question. I think this is directed mostly towards Jeff, but is the horrific nature of nitrogen asphyxia being recognized Or is it downplayed so that it can be used again and again?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this is no slight towards any other method of execution, but I can tell you that from what I saw, I can think of a huge list of other ways I would prefer to be executed than what I saw. I mean, I can think of a firing squad. I can think of a hanging. I can think of um, lethal injection. I mean, you could go on and on. I mean, basically, we're talking about someone being suffocated for 8 to 10 minutes and being borderline conscious, in my mind, upwards of 15 to 17 minutes. So, I mean, it's hard to put any sort of I guess, value, numerical value on pain or anything like that. But I can say that nitrogen hypoxia is it speaks to the lowest level of our humanity. And, I can say that, I mean, even thinking about it it's a lot. There's nobody. It's actually quite a burden, to be quite frank. I mean, there's no one that's been closer to a nitrogen hypoxia execution than I have, and I wasn't. I don't know that I was completely prepared for that when you know when I agreed to be there. Of course, I wouldn't have missed it for the world, but it's just a lot to have to, like, over and over again try to convince people how horrible it was. And this is no slight towards the person who asked the question, but it's not just that you have to relive it. And I thought about this when Randy was talking. It's not just that you have to relive it; you have to relive it as viscerally and as intensely as possible, so that people will understand. Because people are so closed off to wanting to believe that we're capable of such things. But I know Randy would say this, and I certainly would say this as far as nitrogen hypoxia is concerned, that not only are we capable, but we're trying to get good at it, and we're trying to get better at it, and we want to do it again. And until we stand up and until we place our bodies into the conversation, I don't know that politicians are going to stop. I'll say this and then I will get off of it. One of the most disgusting parts, and I would say this too from what Randy described with his brother, one of the most disgusting parts of these executions are you have governors sitting in governors' mansions, attorney generals sitting in their homes, who are champions of these executions, yet do not have to get one hand dirty, one finger dirty in order to make it happen. I mean, there's that old expression from the Vietnam era where politicians who were calling for more war yet were afraid and wouldn't send their sons and daughters to Vietnam, called them chicken hawks. These politicians in these death penalty states are chicken hawks on executions. My daughter, she said, she was talking about vengeance a few weeks ago, and we talk about the death penalty a lot in this house. Strange. My kids are going to need a lot of therapy, but my daughter was talking about it, and she said, well, why do people vote for people to be executed? Why do judges decide for people to be executed? And I said, I don't know. I said, I think there's probably a lot of different reasons. And she said, well, any family, any judge, any jury, or any politician that wants these executions to happen should be forced to do it themselves. And as they say in the church, out of the mouth of babes.
Thank you, guys. I didn't see any questions in the chat. Oh, there's one more question in the Q&A. What gives you all hope in the fight for abolition?
Well, I have hope that y'all asked us here, which means you're thinking about it, you're talking about it. There's other options out there than committing state homicide. And it does start with you, and it starts with advocating that question from earlier. I mean, how I start, and I'm still learning too, is I go to one, like, but my mind just went blank, y'all, but I go to one group, okay, and say Journey of Hope or Abe's group, and then I find other information and I educate myself and I learn more, and then I find more groups, and then there's always things that are going on that you can show up for. And that's what gives me hope, is that there's so many people in the United States and across the world that are absolutely against the death penalty. And so we may be outnumbered and the laws may be against our favor right now, but we are here to fight. And if we don't fight, nothing's going to change.
I'm going to jump in here and I'll say two things. One is Randy gives me hope. Randy, I've known you from a distance for a little while now. Not super close, but I've followed his struggle. I've followed Sarah's struggle. I mean, these people give me hope because they show that the world not just can change, but can change in dramatic and beautiful and magical ways, in ways that we never could expect. And lastly, I'll say that my daughter gives me hope. Just this idea that at 8 years old, she can, in her mind, conceive of a world in which, there's consequences for killing people. And I think that, and I know that's a crazy phrase to be included in this space, but if we really believed that there were consequences for killing people, we wouldn't kill anybody. And if somebody did kill someone, we wouldn't kill them. So the question becomes, what do we believe is at stake? And I think that the fact that this event is happening, the fact that Sarah does the work that she does, Randy does the work he does, Allie, Abe, all these people who are coming from all over the place, y'all, it shows that a lot of people are getting skin in the game. And when you got skin in the game, you're able to push a lot stronger. You're able to believe a lot harder, and you're able to understand that we got to move a lot quicker.
Last but not least, my story resonates with my daughter also. My daughter was about 6 years old, and I had a shirt that said, "Why do we kill people who kill people?" that show that killing is wrong. And she reads that shirt and she goes, "Why do we, Dad? I just don't get it." Whereas my other kids I've got kids from 17 to 47, so a big range. My other kids, they're still working on it, but I think we're teaching the younger generation and showing them that things can be different. And by her saying that to me, and she's very against it. She writes reports in school. She's one of those freedom fighters that believes in human rights and same stuff we're fighting for. It's not just the death penalty, it's human right and criminal justice reform. And, it all comes hand in hand. And I think people are getting it, and we just got to keep doing what we do. And we got to find people that join with us, and sign the petitions and get out there. And, I wouldn't recommend getting arrested like I have 3 or 4 times, but it's what I do that makes me feel better because it reaches a lot of people, at once. And I like that kind of stuff. And even when I got arrested here in Utah State, last thing 2 of the legislators said after they seen my brother's pictures, when I held him up in the galley and was showing them, this is, bloodied bodies of my brother, his bullet holes and everything. At least 2 of the legislators came out against the death penalty the next year, after seeing those pictures. So, one person at a time. And together we will abolish the death penalty. I do believe that. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Into a writing portion, so, of course, just generally reflect on anything that came up for you while listening to these speakers, but I've also got a couple of questions, just whatever sticks really. And again, we have paper and pens right here if you don't have any. Something that I understand we have people all over in the Zoom, something that I would really like for us to think about in this room is which our responsibilities are as future Oregon attorneys, because in Oregon, we have the death penalty, even though there's been a de facto moratorium on it since 2011, it's still on the books. So I'd like for us to think about what that means for us and what our responsibilities are there. Whether that matters, why or why not. And also just what our responsibility is generally as law students to those whose lives have been touched by the death penalty, how we can in our careers or in our personal lives help fight the death penalty and everything that comes afterward, like without parole. And I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but a final question I have, something to reflect on, is another Brian Stevenson quote. A TED talk he did a couple of years back. He said that the death penalty isn't about whether people deserve to die, but whether we have the right to kill them. Like to think where that lands in you. Does that feel true?
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Thanks, Sarah.
you. Good luck with everything.
Sarah, Randy, thank y'all. Y'all are amazing as always.
Bye, Jeff. Bye, Randy.
Bye-bye.